Thank you, Malcolm, and thank you to the Society for asking me to join you tonight. So I thought what I would do is spend the bulk of my comments talking about recent events that have really just occurred over the past, I would say, 6 to 8 months in the United States dealing with dual use. But to put it in perspective, I just wanted to give a little bit of a broader history. So you probably all remember that after the 9/11 attacks, there were a series of letters containing anthrax spores mailed to various individuals in the United States. And that really sort of heightened the awareness of the issue of biosecurity and bioterrorism in the country. And one of the things that happened was that the government asked the National Research Council, which is sort of the official scientific advisors to the US government, to look into this. And they produced a report colloquially known as the Fink report, named after the chairman of the committee, Gerald Fink. And that report pointed out what they called the dual-use dilemma. So that's where the terminology really came from with respect to the life sciences. And one of the recommendations of that report was that the government put together an advisory panel that came to be known as the National Science Advisory Board for Biosecurity. And I served on that board until just a few months ago from its beginning in 2005. So that the NSABB did a number of things, produced a number of products, and one of the things that it really tried to do was to narrow down sort of the scope of what aspect of dual use we should really be concerned about, and that became known as dual use research of concern. And so things kind of plodded along for a while, and then there was the first, what I would consider to be crisis, which was back in the end of 2011, when two groups tried to publish manuscripts that I think Simon will talk more about, where they were able to take H5N1 avian influenza and adapt it to be transmissible from ferret to ferret through an aerosol mechanism. And this raised a lot of concern. The NSABB was asked to advise the government on whether or not that work should be published. And to make a long story short, it ended up that both papers, after a lot of discussion, ended up being published. And I don't have maybe during the question and answer, if people want more detail about that, we can talk about it. And then what happened next was interesting. So from the spring of 2012, when that recommendation was made, and the US government finally released a policy about the oversight of dual use research, which the board had recommended 5 years previously, from that time until this year, nothing happened. So the NSABB didn't meet. There were very few formal discussions or conferences about the topic. But then this year, things really started to pick up. And there were a number of events that I referred to at the other conference as a perfect storm. So first was more papers began to be published. And the lag in publication was because during the time of the original controversy, the influenza research community instituted a moratorium on that type of experiment. And then it took them a while, I think, to get back up and running. So there were more papers published where individuals were enhancing the transmissibility, mainly of avian influenza viruses. Interestingly, there was also a paper published where a laboratory discovered a new strain of the bacterium that produces botulinum toxin. And this botulinum toxin that this strain produces was not able to be neutralized by existing antisera. And so the authors, in conjunction with the editors of that journal, decided that they did not want to publish the full details of that work. And so there were now two sort of things out there. There were, results of experiments that were being published and results of experiments that were not being published in full. As these publications came out, there was more and more vocal criticism of this type of work, so-called gain-of-function research. There were biosafety concerns that were starting to be raised. So the conversation sort of made its way from a biosecurity focus to a biosafety focus. Ethical questions about whether or not these experiments should even be done were being brought up. And so it became more out in the public and among the scientific community, which frankly had not been as engaged as it probably should have been in the US. And I think what really precipitated things were events that occurred at the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta this summer, where there were two laboratory accidents. So in one case, they shipped some H5N1 highly pathogenic avian influenza to a US Department of Agriculture lab by mistake. And the people at the agriculture lab figured it out when the chickens that they inoculated became very sick, because they were supposed to get a strain that was low pathogenicity, was high pathogenicity. And then the other thing that also happened was that workers who were working with Bacillus anthracis, which is the causative agent of anthrax, took some bacteria out of the high containment lab without properly disinfecting it. And so there were these two safety lapses. And around the same time at the NIH, some workers discovered some vials of smallpox that had been sitting in a closet, unbeknownst to anyone. And so there were some very real concerns now in the US about the potential of accidental release of infectious agents. And what happened finally is that last month the White House issued a statement in which it called for a pause in new funding for experiments with 3 respiratory viruses: influenza, MERS, coronavirus, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, and SARS coronavirus, severe acute respiratory syndrome virus. And it also asked that anyone who is already working on these viruses stop their work if there was the possibility that the experiments might lead to some sort of enhanced virulence or transmissibility. So if it sort of met that definition of dual-use research of concern. So there's that pause, and the other thing that the White House called for was it asked both the NSABB, which now had been resuscitated as of last month, and also the Institute of Medicine and the National Academies, which are part of this research arm of the National Research Council, to organize a conference to really start a bona fide, broad discussion of what the risks and benefits of this type of work is. And so the NSABB met last month, and my understanding is what they're doing is trying to come up with a framework for what the risk-benefit analysis should look like. And then the National Academy Institute of Medicine group is going to try to come up with how do you do the risk-benefit analysis? What are the things that we know? What are the things that we don't know and that we need to understand? And so I'm hoping now that there's finally the kind of discussion that probably should have been happening at least 2 years ago when these first papers came to light, but probably should have been happening much longer than that. And so that's where we stand, and I think it's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out.
Thank you very much.